August 13th, 1944, General George S. Patton stood over a map inside Third Army headquarters and felt that rare, dangerous sensation commanders live for. The enemy was finally exposed, and the war itself seemed to be holding its breath. Pasted his armored columns had just taken Ardennes, and beyond that town, the land opened toward Falaise. Only a short drive, only a few hours for tanks that had been devouring miles since the breakout. Patton could see the shape of the trap forming in his mind as clearly as if it were already closed. A huge German force compressed into a shrinking pocket. Their routes jammed, their command lines fraying, their escape narrowed to a single corridor that could be slammed shut with one hard push. The map was not just paper. It was an opportunity. And then the phone rang, and the opportunity became an argument. On the line was General Omar Bradley, calm, measured, and carrying an order that would haunt the Allied campaign long after the dust around Normandy settled. "Stop where you are," Bradley told him. "Do not advance beyond Ardennes." Pasted Patton stiffened. It was not the language of wait for reconnaissance or adjust the plan, but a hard halt at the edge of victory. He stared at the distance on the map like it was a bad joke. Ardennes to Falaise, roughly 15 miles. In Patton's mind, that was nothing. That was a morning's drive for armored spearheads, a swift roll forward to link hands with forces coming down from the north and seal the bag on an entire German army. The German 7th Army was already cracked open. Units were bleeding out in confusion. Roads were crowded with retreating men and vehicles hunted by Allied aircraft. Patton believed the war could be shortened right there, not by speeches or committees, but by moving steel forward while the enemy was still dizzy. His anger came fast and sharp. He argued. He pressed. He demanded the chance to finish what the breakout had started. And, in a flash of Patton's biting tongue, he threw a remark at Bradley that revealed both contempt and urgency. If he were allowed to go to Falaise, he said, the Germans would be trapped so completely that even the British would not have time to miss the victory. Then, with typical Patton harshness, he added that he could drive the British into the sea for another Dunkirk. Pasted, it was not diplomacy, it was pressure. But Bradley did not bend. The order was final. Third Army would stop at Ardennes and wait. Patton hung up and looked back at the map. It was that kind of moment commanders remember forever, because it splits time into two versions. The one that happened, and the one they swear could have happened if they'd been allowed to act. 15 miles. He could almost feel the pocket closing like a fist. But he also knew what it meant to wait. Waiting was oxygen for a trapped enemy. Waiting meant men slipping out at night, staff officers, reorganizing columns, survivors finding new lines, shattered divisions collecting themselves. Waiting meant that something already dying might crawl away and fight again later. Somewhere else, against someone else, at a cost that would not be paid in August, but in later months, in other battles, by other families. In Patton's mind, hesitation wasn't neutral. It had a body count attached. The Falaise Pocket was not a lucky accident that appeared out of nowhere. It was the consequence of pressure building for weeks until the German position in Normandy finally cracked. After the landings, for more than a month, Allied armies had been pinned in the suffocating hedgerow country, forced into brutal close fighting that turned every field into a fort and every lane into a kill zone. British and Canadian troops fought grinding battles around Caen. American forces pushed meter by meter through the bocage. The Germans clung to each line until it was punched through, then fell back to the next, trying to keep the front unbroken, trying to slow the Allies until some miracle might restore the situation. Then, late in July 25, 1944, Operation Cobra smashed through German defenses near St. Lo, and the war suddenly gained speed. Pasted American forces punched a hole. Patton's newly activated Third Army surged through it like water through a broken dam. The German command faced a choice: pull back, shorten the line, save what could be saved, or attempt the kind of bold counterattack that looked heroic on paper and suicidal in reality. Adolf Hitler chose the worst option, ordering an attack instead of a withdrawal. And so, on August 7, 1944, German panzer divisions struck toward Mortain, trying to sever the American breakout and restore the front. Pasted it failed, quickly and catastrophically. Within roughly 2 days, the counterattack had spent itself, leaving German forces stretched and exposed. The front bulged in a way that invited encirclement. Allied forces pressed from multiple directions, and the pocket began to form. By the time August 12, 1944 arrived, the noose was tightening. Pasted more than 100,000 German troops, elements of the 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army, were being squeezed between converging Allied forces. Their only real escape was eastward, through a narrowing corridor that led toward the Seine. German commanders understood the danger. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, tasked with holding France, knew that every hour mattered. But Hitler's orders were rigid. Hold, keep fighting, do not yield ground simply to save troops. The result was a desperate scramble, because even when leaders knew the pocket must be escaped, they were forced to bleed time obeying instructions that belonged to fantasy, not to the battlefield. Patton's forces had already proven what speed could do. Since the beginning of August, Third Army had raced across France, covering huge distances in a short time, liberating towns, breaking through positions that were still being mapped by German staff officers who could not believe the Americans were already there. By the time Patton's spearheads reached Ardennes, the German units inside the pocket were battered and disorganized. Their columns were being hit from above. Their movements were being hammered by artillery. Traffic was snarled. Units were mixed together. Communication was unreliable. It was not a neat retreat. It was a bleeding withdrawal under pressure. The kind of situation where one decisive clamp could turn escape into surrender. Major General Wade Hayslip's 15th Corps had taken Argentan with relatively light resistance. Pasted reconnaissance suggested the route north toward Falaise was not heavily defended. French armored units and American armored divisions nearby were ready to move. Patton saw the classic encirclement that textbooks worship. Push north from Argentan while Allied forces, British, Canadian, and Polish units under Montgomery's overall command, pushed south from the Caen area. The jaws would meet. The pocket would die. The war would leap forward. But war at the level Patton lived in is never only about maps and tanks. It is also about lines drawn by headquarters and the invisible politics stitched into those lines. The boundary between Bradley's American Army Group and Montgomery's Allied Army Group ran directly through the space Patton wanted to cross. Those boundaries existed for good reasons: to reduce confusion, to prevent friendly forces from blundering into each other in smoke and chaos, to keep artillery plans coherent. Yet boundaries can also become cages, especially when the enemy is collapsing, and the only question is whether the collapse will be finished or merely delayed. Patton did not respect boundaries the way cautious planners did. He respected results. He told his staff they were staring at an unparalleled chance to end the campaign in France in one stroke, and that they were going to lose it because of coordination fears and because of personalities. He called Bradley and asked permission to push beyond Argentan into the boundary area toward Falaise. He made it clear he would accept the risks. He would rather manage confusion than allow the enemy to escape. Bradley faced a decision that was not purely tactical. He was not blind to the opportunity. He understood what Patton was trying to do, but Bradley was cautious by nature, shaped by years of staff work, and by a belief that coordination prevented disasters. He had legitimate concerns. American and British forces used different radio systems and recognition procedures. In confused terrain, converging armored columns could misidentify each other. A tragic friendly fire incident was possible. But behind the tactical reasoning was something heavier: command relationships and alliance politics. Montgomery was not Bradley's subordinate in any simple way. He was an Ally commander with his own authority, his own government, his own pride, and his own direct line to higher political leadership. The boundary lines had been negotiated at the top. If American forces crossed into Montgomery's zone without agreement, it would not be interpreted as a minor adjustment. It could be seen as a deliberate slight, a move that risked inflaming months of tension over strategy, credit, and control. Bradley had already spent the campaign dealing with friction. Disagreements over broad front versus concentrated thrusts, arguments over supplies and priorities, disputes over how victories were framed in public. For Bradley, it was not only about whether Patton could drive 15 miles, it was about whether doing so would fracture cooperation at a moment when the alliance needed to look unbreakable. So Bradley made the safe choice. He ordered Patton to halt and stay within the boundary. Pasted, he would wait for Montgomery's forces coming down from the north to complete the closure. In one sense, it was the orderly decision. It respected agreements, reduced the chance of confusion, and avoided a political explosion. In another sense, it was a choice that kept the escape corridor breathing. Patton's reaction was immediate. He protested hard. He argued that German resistance on the road north was thin, that his corps was positioned perfectly, that the chance would not return. He warned that every hour of delay meant more Germans slipping away through the gap. Bradley held the line. He repeated the order. Patton, bound by discipline and duty, obeyed, furious but obedient. The halt was visible on the roads. Tanks that had been racing now sat still. Engines were shut down. Crews climbed onto hulls and watched smoke rise in the distance. They could hear the battle. They were not allowed to finish. The route ahead was not an abstract line. It was a direction, north, and the instinct of every aggressive soldier was to go. Instead, they waited, while explanations about coordination and boundaries circled through the ranks. Patton paced with the map like it was a personal insult. He wrote his bitterness down, convinced he was watching a grave mistake being made in real time. Pasted. While Patton sat at Ardennes, Montgomery's forces were expected to drive south and close the pocket from the north. The Canadians, supported by other Allied formations, were experienced and tough. They had been fighting since the landings, paying for every mile in Normandy. But the advance toward Falaise was slower than Patton believed it needed to be. German units defending the northern shoulder of the pocket fought stubbornly, staging withdrawals that cost time and blood. The terrain still favored defense. The bocage did not vanish simply because the front had moved. Hedgerows and embankments continued to break up attacks. Anti-tank guns were positioned to punish careless movement. Every step south required careful preparation, and Montgomery's style, never reckless, emphasized method and control. Canadian attacks were supported by heavy fire. Advances were measured, not explosive. Casualties were kept down when possible. Progress came in yards and fields rather than in dramatic leaps. By August 16, 1944, 3 days after Patton had been halted, Falaise still had not been taken. Pasted. When the town finally fell on August 17, 1944, the pocket still wasn't sealed. Pasted. The gap shifted eastward, narrowing, but remaining open enough for men to pour through. The race to close the pocket became a messy convergence. British, Canadian, Polish, French, and American units pressed from different angles, each with their own chains of command. Confusion was real. But so was the enemy's desperation. German forces, some disciplined, some collapsing, fought rearguard actions to hold corridors open. Many abandoned heavy equipment. Some fled on foot. Others tried to shepherd columns through the narrowing opening while Allied air power struck at anything moving. Above the roads, Allied fighter bombers attacked relentlessly. Vehicles were knocked out. Retreat routes became choked. Survivors tried to find alternate tracks, fields, and lanes. The pocket became a scene of ruin and panic. Yet even under that pressure, Germans kept pushing east because the alternative was surrender. Von Kluge was replaced by Field Marshal Walter Model on August 17, 1944, and Model's orders were blunt. Break out, fight through, get to the Seine, because staying inside the pocket meant destruction. Pasted. By August 19, 1944, Polish forces reached Chambois, and American units linked with them near Saint-Lambert-sur-Dive. Pasted. The closure was tightening fast, but the pocket did not become fully sealed until August 21, 1944, when organized resistance inside collapsed and the trap finally snapped shut. Pasted by then, many had already escaped. How many escaped has been argued over for decades because war does not produce clean ledgers. Allied forces captured a vast number of prisoners and counted significant enemy losses in men and equipment, but German records and post-war analyses suggest that a large portion, tens of thousands, slipped out through the shifting gap before it was completely closed. Pasted. And the most important detail was not merely the number, but the quality. Among the escapees were veterans, officers, experienced non-commissioned leaders, and hardened troops from elite formations. Men who knew how to fight, how to improvise, how to train replacements, how to hold under fire. Those were exactly the kind of survivors a defeated army needs if it wants to stop being defeated. These veterans did not disappear. They retreated, regrouped, and became a foundation around which units could be rebuilt. The escaped corps helped form defensive lines farther east. They helped stiffen positions along the German border. They contributed experience to formations that would meet Allied armies again in autumn and winter. Patton believed this connection was not theoretical. He believed it was direct. He believed that leaving the gap open even a short time had allowed the enemy to carry fighting strength out of Normandy and into the next chapters of the war. That next chapter arrived with brutal timing. On December 16, 1944, German forces launched their last great offensive in the West, striking through the Ardennes in a bid to split Allied armies and force a political collapse. Pasted, it was a surprise blow, delivered with a concentration of armor and determination that many Allied planners had not expected Germany could still muster. The Battle of the Bulge became the bloodiest American battle in Europe. American losses were enormous, and among the German formations driving into the snow were units that had been mauled months earlier in Normandy. Units that had survived because enough of their experienced corps had made it out through the Falaise escape corridor. Pasted Patton, called north to relieve surrounded forces and blunt the German thrust, encountered stubborn opposition and recognized names and unit histories that felt like echoes. In his mind, the argument from August had never ended. It had merely changed scenery, from sunlit French fields to frozen forests. He had predicted that an enemy allowed to escape would come back to kill again. Now, as Third Army fought hard through winter resistance, he felt the cost of those earlier decisions in daily casualty lists. He did not celebrate being right. There was no satisfaction in vindication measured in lives. Bradley, later, would admit that halting Patton at Ardennes was probably a mistake. Pasted publicly, he emphasized friendly fire risk and coordination difficulties, which were real considerations. But critics argued the explanation was too thin to carry the weight of what was lost. In later link-ups between Allied forces of different nations, coordination had worked without catastrophe. The deeper truth, many believed, was that Bradley had been balancing military opportunity against alliance stability and the fragile egos of senior command. He chose harmony over speed. In a coalition, that is often the choice leaders feel forced to make. The consequences rolled forward into the autumn. As German survivors withdrew toward the Seine and then into prepared defenses nearer the German border, Allied armies met resistance that was tougher than it might have been if Normandy had ended with total encirclement. The fighting through late summer and fall was brutal and exhausting. Attacks against fortified lines cost dearly. Dense forests, defended ridges, and entrenched positions demanded repeated assaults. Many of these battles became grinding, contests that are less famous than the Ardennes, but swallowed men just as steadily. The war did not end quickly. It continued through months of hard combat, and with every month came more telegrams, more empty chairs at kitchen tables, more names carved into rows of grave markers. Patton believed until the end of his life that failing to close the pocket faster extended the war significantly. Pasted. Whether the war could truly have been shortened by a precise number of months is something no one can prove, because war is not a single lever that can be pulled to change everything. But what can be said is simpler and harsher. Time mattered, and time was given to a beaten enemy. The gap stayed open long enough for a meaningful portion of German forces, especially experienced leaders and troops, to escape and fight again. The later battles were not caused by a single decision, but they were influenced by it, and the influence was paid for with real lives. Historians still argue because the debate sits on the fault line between two truths. One truth says that battlefield opportunity should be seized immediately, that a commander who can end a campaign must be allowed to move, and that risk, especially manageable risk, should not be allowed to protect pride or paperwork. Another truth says coalition warfare is a fragile machine, that a spectacular tactical success can be undermined by political rupture, and that commanders sometimes must accept an imperfect outcome to preserve unity for the long war ahead. Bradley's caution was understandable. Patton's fury was understandable. And the result, neither fully orderly nor fully decisive, left room for the enemy to escape. If Patton had been allowed to drive from Ardennes toward Falaise on August 13, 1944, could he have closed the gap quickly? On the tactical level, it is hard to imagine Third Army's armor not covering that distance fast, especially against thin defenses and a shaken enemy. Pasted. Would it have trapped every single German soldier? Probably not. Some would have slipped out before the jaws met. Some might have fought through. But the pocket would likely have been tighter sooner, and the number of experienced soldiers escaping, those precious cadres Germany needed, could have been significantly reduced. That is the heart of the tragedy. Not that the Germans escaped entirely, but that enough escaped to matter. Bradley made his choice. Patton obeyed. The corridor stayed open, shifting and narrowing, but open long enough to let a wounded enemy crawl out. The pocket eventually closed, but the moment Patton wanted, the swift, clean seal, never arrived. Months later, in the winter cold, Americans fought German units that should have been captured or destroyed earlier, and the bitter logic of the argument returned. In August, it had been a phone call and a map. By December, it was a battlefield and a casualty list. The distance between Ardennes and Falaise was only 15 miles, but the distance between what might have been and what happened stretched across the rest of the war.